Sometimes, in the quietest moments of night, when moonlight touches your window just so, you might hear the whisper of words that once danced across parchment centuries ago. Tonight, we are discovering the gentle story of a poetess whose verses once shaped hearts and minds, though now only precious fragments remain, like silver threads of moonlight caught in time's gentle hands. Whether you're nestled in your cozy bed far from city lights, or perhaps surrounded by the soft hum of distant traffic, I hope you've found that perfect spot where comfort embraces you completely. Your pillows arranged just right, your blankets creating that wonderful cocoon of warmth. If this story brings you the peace you seek tonight, a gentle light helps other restless souls find their way to these calming words too. Let's take a moment, just a moment, to let your shoulders soften into whatever surface holds you. Notice how your breathing has already begun to slow, becoming deeper, more peaceful, the weight of the day dissolving like morning mist. Any lingering thoughts from earlier can simply drift away now, floating off like dandelion seeds on a warm evening breeze. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, except right here, listening to this gentle tale unfold. Time is softly carrying us backward now, through layers of years that fold away like silk scarves, back to an era when candlelight and moonbeams were the only companions to those who rode through the night. Her name was Celeste, though history remembers her simply as the Moonlight Poetess, born in a small village where lavender grew wild along stone walls, where the church bells marked time in gentle bronze tones that drifted across meadows. The year was 1798, or perhaps 1799. The exact date matters less than the softness of those early spring mornings when she first opened her eyes to this world. The cottage where she spent her earliest years sat nestled against a hillside, its thick walls built from stones that had been warming and cooling with the seasons for over 200 years. Small windows with wavy glass caught the morning light and scattered it into gentle rainbows across whitewashed walls. Her mother would later tell stories of how even as an infant, Celeste seemed most content during the evening hours. Her crying would cease the moment moonlight touched her cradle, as if she recognized an old friend. Those first years unfolded in a rhythm as peaceful as breathing. Her father was a bookbinder, spending his days in a workshop that smelled of leather and glue, of paper and patience. The gentle sounds of his work, the soft scraping of tools, the whisper of pages being turned. These became the lullabies of her childhood. While other children played with wooden toys, little Celeste would sit for hours watching dust motes dance in shafts of afternoon light, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air as if she were already writing invisible verses. Her mother, Elizabeth, tended their small garden where herbs grew in neat rows: rosemary and thyme, sage and chamomile, plants that released their fragrance when evening dew settled upon them. She would carry Celeste through the garden in those twilight hours, naming each plant in a voice soft as velvet. This is lavender. It helps us sleep. This is lemon balm. It calms the spirit. The child would reach out tiny hands, not to grasp, but to gently touch, as if greeting each plant with quiet reverence. The village itself moved through time like a slow river. Merchants arrived on Tuesday mornings with fabric and thread, with sugar wrapped in blue paper, with news from distant towns that seemed as far away as the stars. The blacksmith's hammer created a rhythm that echoed across rooftops, steady and sure, while the baker's ovens released the scent of fresh bread that mingled with wood smoke in the evening air. When Celeste reached her 4th year, something remarkable happened, though it seemed quite ordinary at the time. She was sitting in her father's workshop, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of half-bound books and scattered papers. The late afternoon light was particularly golden that day, streaming through the window and illuminating tiny particles of paper dust that floated like miniature stars. Her father was working quietly, his hands moving in practiced motions, when suddenly Celeste spoke her first complete sentence. Not the typical utterances of a child, but something altogether different. "The light writes stories on the wall," she said, her voice carrying a quality that made her father pause in his work. He looked at his daughter, really looked, and saw her watching the shadows of leaves dancing across the plastered surface, creating an ever-changing tapestry of light and shade. From that moment, he knew she saw the world through different eyes. Eyes that found poetry in the simplest movements of everyday life. As autumn arrived that year, painting the countryside in shades of amber and rust, Celeste's unusual gift became more apparent. She would stand at the window during gentle rain showers, whispering words that seemed to match the rhythm of droplets on glass. Pitter, patter, silver, scatter. Her parents exchanged glances but never discouraged these moments, sensing something precious unfolding, like watching a flower bloom in extremely slow motion. The winter of her 5th year brought deep snow that muffled all sound, creating a world wrapped in white silence. Celeste would press her small face against the cold window panes, her breath creating clouds of fog that she would draw in with her finger. Not pictures, but shapes that looked almost like letters, though she had not yet learned to read or write. Her mother would find her, like this, in the early morning, having somehow slipped from her bed before dawn, drawn to watch the way moonlight transformed the snow into fields of diamonds. The village schoolmaster, an elderly man named Thomas Hartwell, lived 3 cottages away, his own children grown and gone. He had taken to spending his evenings reading by candlelight, his cat purring on his lap. Through his window, he would sometimes see the little girl from the bookbinder's family standing in her garden at dusk, her face turned up toward the sky as if listening to something only she could hear. One evening, curiosity overcame propriety, and he ventured out to speak with her parents. "Your daughter," he began carefully, settling into the worn wooden chair by their fire. "She has an unusual quality about her. Have you considered her education?" The conversation that followed would change the course of Celeste's life, though none of them knew it at the time. Master Hartwell offered to teach her to read and write earlier than most children began, sensing that conventional timing would not suit this unconventional child. And so, on a morning when frost painted delicate patterns on every surface, Celeste entered Master Hartwell's study for the first time. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, their leather spines creating a patchwork of browns and burgundies, greens and blues. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air like incense. For a moment, the little girl stood perfectly still, as if absorbing the atmosphere through her very skin. Then she walked slowly to the window where a shaft of morning light illuminated a desk covered in papers. "This," said Master Hartwell, dipping a quill into ink, "is how we capture words." He drew a single letter, the letter M, its curves flowing like hills against the horizon. Celeste watched, mesmerized, as the wet ink gleamed in the light before drying to a deep black. "Ma'am," she whispered, "like the moon, like mother, like morning mist." The old teacher's eyes widened slightly. Most children simply repeated the sound. But this one, she was already finding connections, creating webs of meaning. The lessons that followed were unlike any Master Hartwell had conducted in his 40 years of teaching. Celeste absorbed letters and words not as mere tools of communication, but as living things with texture and weight. She would run her small fingers over the written words, feeling the slight indentation where the quill had pressed into paper. She learned to read by candlelight, her shadow dancing on the wall behind her as she sounded out syllables. Spring returned to the village with a whisper of warm wind, bringing the scent of apple blossoms and fresh grass. Celeste was now spending her mornings with Master Hartwell and her afternoons in her father's workshop, where she was allowed to practice, writing on scraps of paper deemed too damaged for proper bookbinding. Her letters were uneven at first, wandering across the page like ants following an invisible trail. But gradually, they began to form lines, and those lines began to carry meaning. One evening, as purple twilight settled over the village, Celeste's mother found her sitting by the open window of her small bedroom, a piece of paper on her lap and a stub of pencil in her hand. She was 6 years old now, and the baby roundness had begun to leave her face, replaced by the first hints of the thoughtful young woman she would become. "What are you writing, my dear?" her mother asked, settling beside her on the window seat. Celeste looked up, her eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "I'm writing what the evening says," she replied, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Her mother looked at the paper and saw words scattered across it like seeds. Soft purple, whisper, home, nest, rest. Not a sentence, not yet. But something was taking shape, like the first threads of a tapestry being woven. That summer passed in a gentle blur of golden days and silver nights. Celeste grew stronger in her reading, devouring the simple books Master Hartwell provided. Stories of travelers and far-off lands, tales of ancient times when the world was younger. But more than reading, she was observing, always observing. The way smoke rose from chimneys in the still morning air, the pattern swallows made as they swooped through the evening sky, the sound of her mother's humming as she prepared the evening meal. Her father began to save the finest scraps of paper for her, smooth pieces without blemish, understanding that his daughter needed them the way a painter needs canvas. He even taught her to make her own simple notebooks, folding and stitching pages together with careful precision. These little books became her constant companions, tugged into her pocket or held close like treasured friends. The village itself seemed to embrace the young poetess, though no one called her that yet. she was simply Celeste, the bookbinder's unusual daughter who could be found sitting beneath the old oak tree at a village center, writing in her little books while other children played. The baker's wife would sometimes leave a warm roll on the stone wall, where Celeste liked to sit. The blacksmith would nod to her as she passed, his smile gentle beneath his soot-darkened face. As autumn approached once more, bringing with it the harvest season, something shifted in Celeste's writing. The scattered words began to form patterns, like birds organizing themselves for migration. Master Hartwell noticed it first during one of their morning lessons. She had written something on her slate, and instead of the usual practice sentences about cats sitting on mats, there was something else entirely. Yellow leaves danced down, whispering summer's farewell, while trees prepare for sleeping time. The old teacher read it once, then again. These were not the words of a 6-year-old child, or rather, they were, but they carried something more, a quality of observation and feeling that transcended age. "Celeste," he said softly, "this is quite beautiful. Have you written others like this?" She nodded, reaching into her pocket to pull out her current notebook. Its pages were filled with similar fragments, some crossed out and rewritten, others standing alone like small perfect shells found on a beach. "The moon told me to write them down," she said simply. She said, "If I don't, they'll float away like dandelion seeds." Master Hartwell studied the child before him, her serious grey eyes, her ink-stained fingers, the way she held her pencil as if it were a magic wand capable of capturing the invisible. "Would you like to learn about poetry?" he asked. "About the ways words can dance together, about rhythm and rhyme, and the music that lives inside language." The smile that spread across Celeste's face was like sunrise after a long night. "Oh yes," she breathed. "Yes, please." And so began a new chapter in her education. Master Hartwell pulled down volumes of poetry from his highest shelves, books that had been waiting patiently for years, their pages yellowed, but their words still vibrant. He introduced her to the great poets of ages past, reading aloud in his creaky voice while autumn rain tapped against the windows. The ancient Greeks who sang of gods and heroes, the romantic poets who found divinity in nature, the mystics who wrote of love and longing. But it was the moon poets who captured Celeste's imagination most completely. Those writers throughout history who had found inspiration in lunar light, who had written their finest verses while the world slept. She would sit transfixed as Master Hartwell read their words, her eyes growing distant as if she was seeing something beyond the small study, beyond the village, beyond the present moment entirely. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that fell in thick, soft flakes like feathers from an enormous white bird. Celeste's parents noticed that she had begun to sleep less, often finding her at her window in the middle of the night, writing by moonlight. They worried at first, but the child showed no signs of tiredness during the day. In fact, she seemed more alive than ever. Her cheeks pink with health, her eyes bright with an inner light. The notebooks multiplied, filling a small shelf her father built specially for them. Each one dated in her increasingly steady hand, containing the fragments of poetry that seemed to flow from her as naturally as breath. She wrote about everything and nothing, about the specific and the universal. A cat's paw print in fresh snow became a meditation on temporary beauty. The sound of wind in the chimney became a conversation with ancient spirits. The village began to take notice in small ways. Master Hartwell, with Celeste's shy permission, shared one of her poems with the minister, who read it aloud during a winter evening service. It was a simple piece about candlelight pushing back the darkness, about how even the smallest flame could create a circle of warmth and safety. The congregation sat in unusual silence after the reading, each person feeling as if the words had been written specially for them. Soon, requests began to trickle in. The baker's wife, who had recently lost her mother, asked if Celeste might have any words about remembering. The young couple preparing for their first child wondered if she had written anything about new beginnings. Celeste, still only 7 years old, would listen to these requests with grave attention, then retreat to her room, returning hours or sometimes days later with a few lines written in her careful hand. These poems were different from her moon verses. Those she kept private, written in special notebooks that she stored in a wooden box beneath her bed. The moon poems were conversations. She explained to her mother one evening. Conversations between her heart and the night sky. They weren't meant for other eyes, at least not yet. Her mother understood, recognizing the need for privacy in the creative soul, even one so young. Spring arrived with a burst of apple blossoms that turned the orchards into clouds of pink and white. Celeste was growing taller, her baby teeth giving way to adult ones, her hands becoming more sure with the pen. Master Hartwell introduced her to more complex forms of poetry, sonnets and villanelles, haikus from the distant east. She absorbed each form like a sponge, but always returned to her own natural voice, which seemed to exist somewhere between structure and freedom. One particularly warm evening in May, when the air was heavy with the scent of blooming lilacs, Celeste experienced what she would later call her first true vision. She was sitting in the garden, watching the sun set behind the hills, when suddenly the entire world seemed to shimmer, as if reality had become thin as gauze. Through this veil, she saw words, actual words, floating in the air like golden butterflies. They arranged themselves into patterns she had never seen before, creating meanings that went beyond language. She rushed inside for her notebook, her hands trembling with excitement, and began to write. The words poured out in a torrent, filling page after page. Her parents found her hours later, still writing by the light of a single candle, tears streaming down her face though she was smiling. When they asked if she was all right, she could only nod, unable to explain what had happened. How the universe had opened itself to her for just a moment, showing her the poetry that existed in the very fabric of existence. The poem she wrote that night, which she titled simply Moonrise, would become one of the few complete works to survive through the centuries. Though she was only 7 years old when she wrote it, it contained a wisdom and beauty that seemed to come from outside time itself. Master Hartwell, when he read it the next day, had to sit down, his old hands shaking slightly. "My dear child," he said finally, "you have a gift that I can only help to nurture. I cannot teach you what you already know." Summer bloomed full and warm, bringing long days that seemed to stretch like taffy. Celeste spent more time outdoors, often walking to the small stream that ran through the meadow beyond the village. She would sit on the bank for hours, her feet dangling in the cool water, writing, always writing. The local children had stopped trying to invite her to their games, understanding somehow that she was engaged in a different kind of play, one that required solitude and silence. Her relationship with the moon deepened during these summer nights. She would wait for it to rise, greeting it like a beloved friend. Then, right by its light until dawn, touched the eastern sky. Her parents had given up trying to maintain a normal bedtime, recognizing that their daughter followed a different rhythm, one dictated by something larger than conventional routine. The notebooks from that summer contained some of her most luminous work, verses that spoke of the connection between earth and sky, between the temporal and the eternal. She wrote about dewdrops as tiny worlds, about how spider webs became visible only when touched by morning mist, about the conversations between stars that could only be heard in perfect stillness. Each poem was a door opening onto a vast landscape of meaning. One August evening, when the heat of day had finally given way to a cooling breeze, a traveling scholar arrived in the village. Professor Edmund Gray, from the university in the distant capital, had heard rumors of a child poet and had come to investigate, expecting to find nothing more than local exaggeration. He took lodging at the inn and made inquiries, following the thread of stories that led, inevitably, to the bookbinder's cottage. When he knocked on their door the following morning, Celeste was in the garden, gathering lavender with her mother. Her father answered, wiping his hands on his leather apron, slightly suspicious of this well-dressed stranger with his city manners. But Professor Gray was patient and gentle, explaining that he studied the development of literary talent, that he had traveled to many villages, seeking young writers who might benefit from proper patronage. The conversation moved to the garden, where Celeste stood partially hidden behind her mother, watching the stranger with those gray eyes that seemed to see through surface things. Professor Gray, who had met hundreds of children in his research, felt something shift in his chest when those eyes met his. There was an ancient quality to her gaze, as if she had lived many lifetimes and remembered them all. "I understand you write poetry," he said gently, crouching down to be at her eye level. Though even at 8 years old, she had a dignity that made the gesture seem unnecessary. "Would you be willing to share something with me?" Celeste considered for a long moment, then nodded, slowly. She disappeared into the cottage and returned with one of her regular notebooks, not the moon volumes. Those remained secret. She handed it to him open to a particular page, then stepped back to stand beside her mother, whose hand rested protectively on her shoulder. Professor Gray read in silence, his expression changing from polite interest to genuine amazement. The poem was about morning glories climbing a fence, but it was also about perseverance and faith, about reaching toward light even when rooted in shadow. The language was simple enough for a child to have written, yet the underlying meaning resonated with profound understanding. "May I?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "May I read more?" The rest of that morning passed in a kind of suspended time. Professor Gray sat in the garden reading through Celeste's notebooks while she and her mother continued their herb gathering. Her father returned to his workshop but kept glancing out the window, protective and watchful. Occasionally, the professor would make a small sound of surprise or appreciation. Once he actually gasped, causing everyone to look at him. "This child," he said finally, closing the notebook with infinite care, "has a gift that appears perhaps once in a generation. These poems, they're not just talented for her age. They are genuinely significant works of literature. With proper cultivation, she could become one of the great voices of our time." The words hung in the air like morning mist, full of possibility and uncertainty. Celeste's parents exchanged glances, their faces revealing the conflict between pride and protectiveness. They had always known their daughter was special, but having it confirmed by an outsider, especially one from the university, made it suddenly real in a different way. "What would you propose?" her father asked carefully, his voice carrying the weight of paternal concern. Professor Gray outlined his vision. Celeste would remain at home. This was crucial, he emphasized, her connection to this place, to the rhythms of village life, to her beloved moon. These were clearly the sources of her inspiration. But he would arrange for advanced tutoring, for access to books and materials, for her work to be properly preserved and, when she was ready, possibly published. "She's still so young," her mother said softly, her arm drawing Celeste closer. "Indeed," Professor Gray agreed, "which is why we must proceed with utmost care. The last thing we want is to overwhelm her gift or push it in directions it's not meant to go. Think of me not as someone who wants to change her, but as someone who wants to ensure her voice is heard and preserved." That evening, after Professor Gray had returned to the inn, the family sat together by the fire, discussing the unexpected development. Celeste listened more than she spoke, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When finally asked what she thought, she was quiet for so long they wondered if she would answer at all. "The moon says," she began slowly, "that some gifts are meant to be shared, like seeds that need to travel on the wind to find new soil. But she also says that the source must be protected, that I must never forget where the words come from." Her parents nodded, understanding in their own way what she meant. It was decided that Professor Gray could return, that they would consider his proposals, but that Celeste's well-being would always come first. If at any point the attention became too much, or if her gift began to dim under scrutiny, everything would stop. The professor proved true to his word. He returned to the capital and began making arrangements, but with a delicacy that surprised everyone. There were no sudden intrusions, no parade of visitors. Instead, books began arriving. Carefully chosen volumes that expanded Celeste's understanding of poetry without overwhelming her natural voice. A new writing desk appeared, crafted from cherry wood and perfectly sized for a child, with drawers for her notebooks and a special shelf for her moon volumes. Master Hartwell found himself with an assistant, a young scholar named Margaret who had studied ancient languages. She brought with her knowledge of poetry from distant lands, from Persia and India, from China and Japan. Celeste absorbed these new forms like rain on thirsty ground, finding in them echoes of things she had always felt but never had words for. Autumn arrived with its familiar rhythm of harvest and preparation. The village continued its ancient patterns while slowly adjusting to the reality that something extraordinary was happening in their midst. The baker's wife began setting aside the finest paper from her husband's flour sacks, bleaching it white for Celeste to write on. The blacksmith crafted a special holder for candles that would cast the best light for nighttime writing. Celeste herself seemed remarkably unchanged by the attention. She continued her walks, her garden observations, her conversations with the moon. If anything, she became even more focused, spending entire days working on single poems, crossing out words and replacing them, searching for the exact combination that would capture what she was trying to express. One November evening, when the first frost was painting the windows with crystalline patterns, Celeste completed what she considered her first real poem. Not just fragments or observations, but a complete work that felt finished, whole. She had been writing it for 3 months, returning to it again and again, adjusting single words, changing line breaks, listening to how it sounded when read aloud. The poem was about twilight, that liminal time between day and night. But it was also about transformation, about the spaces between things where magic lives. When she finally read it to her parents, her voice steady despite her nervousness, they both found tears on their cheeks. Not from sadness, but from the kind of beauty that touches something deep in the human soul. Margaret, who had become a regular presence in their lives, asked permission to send the poem to Professor Gray, who was maintaining a careful archive of all Celeste's work. He had plans, he had mentioned, for a special collection, but not until she was older. Not until there was enough material to show the full range of her gift. For now, preservation was the goal, ensuring that these precious words would not be lost to time. Winter descended gradually that year, beginning with light snows that dusted the village like powdered sugar, then deepening into heavy blankets that muffled all sound. Celeste entered what she would later call her white period, writing poems that were spare and crystalline, using empty space on the page as consciously as she used words. The influence of the Eastern poetry Margaret had introduced was evident, but filtered through Celeste's unique sensibility. She had begun to develop what would become her signature style, a way of writing that seemed simple on the surface but revealed layers of meaning with each reading. Her poems could be understood by children, yet scholars would later write entire dissertations about the complexity hidden within their apparent simplicity. This paradox, this ability to be both accessible and profound, would become one of the hallmarks of her work. The winter solstice brought the longest night of the year, and with it, a special kind of inspiration for the young poetess. She stayed awake the entire night, writing by moonlight and candlelight, filling an entire notebook with verses that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. Her parents found her the next morning, asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on her arms, the final poem still wet with ink. These solstice poems were different from her usual work. They spoke of time and eternity, of the wheel of seasons and the constancy of change. They contained a wisdom, that seemed impossible for a 9-year-old child. Yet there was also a playfulness, a joy in language that could only come from someone discovering the power of words for the first time. As the new year began, bringing with it fresh snow and the distant promise of spring, changes were stirring beyond the village boundaries. Professor Gray had shared some of Celeste's work, with permission, among a small circle of literary scholars. The response had been extraordinary. There were debates about whether a child could have really written such sophisticated verse, discussions about the nature of genius, proposals for how best to nurture such rare talent. But in the village, life continued its gentle rhythm. Celeste helped her mother in the garden, planning what they would plant come spring. She assisted her father in the workshop, learning to bind books properly, a skill that would serve her well in years to come. She continued her studies with Master Hartwell and Margaret, expanding her knowledge while maintaining her unique voice. The moon remained her most faithful companion. She had begun to track its phases, noting how her writing changed with its waxing and waning. Full moon poems were expansive, filled with silver light and possibility. New moon poems were interior, exploring the darkness where seeds germinate. The crescent moons brought transitional verses, poems about becoming and unbecoming. One particularly clear February night, when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Celeste had another of her visions. This time she saw herself as an old woman, sitting at a desk by a window, still writing by moonlight. But she also saw her words, scattered like stars across time, being read by people not yet born, offering comfort to souls she would never meet. The vision filled her with both joy and sadness, understanding for the first time the weight and privilege of her gift. She wrote about the vision, trying to capture the feeling of seeing one's future and past simultaneously. The resulting poem would become one of her most celebrated works, though it wouldn't be discovered until long after her death, hidden in one of her moon notebooks that would be found in an attic centuries later. Spring's first whispers began in March, bringing longer days and the sound of snow melting from rooftops. Celeste could feel something building within her, like sap rising in trees. She had been writing for 3 years now with serious intention, and her voice was becoming stronger, more distinctive. The childish uncertainties were falling away, replaced by a growing confidence in her ability to translate the ineffable into words. Margaret brought news from the capital. A small literary journal wanted to publish 3 of Celeste's poems, with her parents' permission, of course. The editors understood she was young, but the work stood on its own merit. They would use only her initials, preserving her privacy while allowing her voice to enter the wider world. The family discussed it at length, weighing the benefits and risks. Celeste herself was surprisingly pragmatic about it. "The poems want to travel," she said simply. "They've told me they're ready." And so it was decided. 3 poems would venture out into the world, like birds leaving the nest. They were carefully chosen, pieces that represented her range without revealing too much of her inner world. A poem about rain on summer leaves, another about the first snow of winter, and a third about the way candlelight creates a small world within darkness. The spring equinox brought balance between day and night, and with it, a sense of equilibrium in Celeste's life. She had found a rhythm that worked: mornings for study, afternoons for observation and note-taking, evenings for family, and nights for her true work, the moon poems that continued to accumulate in her special notebooks. Her 10th birthday approached with the apple blossoms, bringing with it a sense of transition. She was no longer truly a child, though not yet approaching womanhood. She existed in that magical middle space where imagination and intelligence merged, where the boundaries between the possible and impossible remained fluid. Professor Gray visited again, bringing with him the journal containing her published poems, the sight of her words in print, formatted properly with her initials at the bottom. CMW, for Celeste Marie Winters, affected her more than she expected. It wasn't pride exactly, more a sense of responsibility. These words would outlive her, would continue speaking when she was silent that evening. As purple dusk settled over the village like a comfortable blanket, Celeste sat in her favorite spot in the garden. She could hear her mother preparing dinner, smell the bread her father had brought from the baker, hear the distant sound of children playing one last game before nightfall. Everything was exactly as it had always been, yet everything had changed. She opened a fresh notebook, one of the special ones she saved for moon poems, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a stream finding its course. She wrote about permanence and impermanence, about how words could be both, existing on paper that would eventually crumble, yet continuing in the minds and hearts of readers. The moon rose full and bright that night, casting silver light across her page. She wrote until her hand cramped, then switched to her left hand and continued. The poems that emerged were unlike anything she had written before. They were the conversations with future readers, messages in bottles thrown into the ocean of time. As summer deepened into long, drowsy afternoons, where even the bees seemed to move more slowly through the lavender, Celeste entered what would become known as her period of profound listening. She would spend hours in complete stillness, not writing, just absorbing the subtle rhythms of the world around her. The way grass whispered different secrets depending on which direction the wind was blowing. How the old oak tree at the village center creaked out stories of all the generations who had rested in its shade. The particular quality of silence that settled over everything in those moments just before rain. Her notebooks from this time show a marked evolution. The poems became less frequent but more substantial, like rivers that run deeper rather than wider. She would work on single pieces for weeks, sometimes months, returning to them the way a sculptor returns to stone, removing everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. Margaret noticed that Celeste had begun to incorporate blank space as deliberately as words, understanding that silence could speak as eloquently as sound. The village had grown accustomed to their young poetess, accepting her peculiarities with the kind of gentle tolerance that small communities sometimes extend to those they recognize as touched by something larger than ordinary life. The baker's wife would leave fresh rolls on the garden wall without fanfare. The blacksmith had crafted a special lantern that cast the perfect light for nighttime writing. Small kindnesses that created a protective circle around the girl who spent her nights conversing with the moon. Professor Gray's visits had become seasonal events, arriving with the reliability of migrating birds. He would spend a week each quarter reviewing Celeste's new work, discussing literature and philosophy in terms simple enough for a 10-year-old to grasp yet sophisticated enough to challenge her growing intellect. He had begun to bring other texts, not just poetry but natural philosophy, astronomy, ancient mythology, feeding her mind the varied diet it craved. One particularly memorable autumn evening, when the harvest moon hung enormous and golden above the horizon, Celeste experienced what she would later describe as a moment of complete understanding. She was walking alone through the meadow beyond the village, the dry grass rustling beneath her feet, when suddenly everything, the moon, the stars, the earth beneath her, the air she breathed, revealed itself as one vast poem, written in a language older than words. She stood transfixed for what might have been minutes or hours, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the beauty and interconnectedness of all things. When she finally returned home, her parents were worried by her expression. Something had changed in her face. A new depth had entered her grey eyes. She couldn't explain what had happened. How could words capture an experience that transcended language itself? Instead, she went to her room and began writing. Not poems exactly, but fragments, impressions, attempting to translate the untranslatable. These fragments would later be recognized as the beginning of her most important work, though at the time they seemed almost like a different kind of writing altogether. Less concerned with traditional poetic structure, more focused on capturing states of consciousness, moments when the boundary between self and world became permeable. They were difficult pieces, requiring readers to slow down, to enter a different rhythm of understanding. Winter arrived gently that year, beginning with frost that decorated windows with intricate patterns that Celeste would study for hours, finding in them maps to invisible countries, alphabets of forgotten languages. She had begun to sleep even less, though she showed no signs of exhaustion. Her parents had stopped worrying, recognizing that their daughter operated according to different natural laws, like those deep-sea creatures that generate their own light. The moon poems had evolved into something extraordinary, no longer simple observations or even complex meditations. They had become what scholars would later call her lunar symphonies, multi-part works that wove together personal reflection, natural observation, philosophical inquiry, and something ineffable, something that seemed to come from beyond the individual consciousness. She kept these in a special trunk her father had made, lined with silk to protect the papers from moisture and time. On her 11th birthday, as apple blossoms once again transformed the orchards into clouds of pink and white, a letter arrived that would alter the trajectory of her life. A prestigious literary academy in the capital had awarded her their youngest poetry prize. Not a children's award, but recognition alongside adult poets. The prize came with a small stipend and an invitation to visit the academy, to meet other poets and scholars. The family debated at length. Celeste had never traveled beyond the nearest market town. The capital was a 3-day journey by carriage, a world away from the quiet rhythms of village life. Yet there was also recognition that she might benefit from exposure to other literary minds, from access to the great libraries, from conversations with those who had dedicated their lives to the written word. In the end, it was Celeste herself who made the decision, consulting as always with her celestial advisor. "The moon travels," she said one evening. "She visits all parts of the earth, never losing her essential nature. Perhaps I can do the same." It was decided that she would go, accompanied by her father and Margaret, for a 2-week visit in early summer. The journey itself became a source of inspiration. Celeste had never seen how the landscape changed as one moved through it, how villages gave way to forests, forests to hills, hills to the sprawling approach to the great city. She filled a notebook with observations, the way dust motes danced differently in unfamiliar light, how the dialect of birdsong shifted with geography, the particular loneliness of traveling through places where you knew no one and no one knew you. The capital overwhelmed her at first. So many buildings crowding together, blocking out the sky. The noise that never ceased, even at night. The absence of stars, hidden behind a veil of smoke and city light. She spent the first 2 days in their modest lodgings, unable to write, feeling as if the source of her inspiration had been severed. But on the 3rd night, Margaret took her up to the roof of their building. Above the immediate chaos of the streets, Celeste could finally see the moon, somewhat dimmed by the city's glow but still present, still faithful. She understood then that the poetry wasn't in the place but in the connection, in the ability to find that quiet center regardless of external circumstances. The academy proved to be a revelation of a different sort. The library contained thousands upon thousands of books, reaching up 3 stories with ladders on wheels to access the highest shelves. Celeste spent entire days there, not reading systematically but following her intuition, pulling down volumes that seemed to call to her, discovering poets from centuries past who had struggled with the same questions, felt the same inexplicable pull toward expressing the inexpressible. She met other poets too, adults who treated her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some were skeptical, unable to believe that such sophisticated work could come from someone so young. Others recognized immediately what Professor Gray had seen, that age was irrelevant when it came to true gift. She attended readings where poets shared their work aloud, learning how words could sound different in different voices, how the same poem could carry multiple meanings depending on how it was spoken. But perhaps the most significant encounter was with an elderly woman named Sophia Blackston, a poet whose work Celeste had admired without knowing anything about the author. Sophia was nearly 80, her hair white as moonlight, her hands gnarled with age but still steady when holding a pen. She invited Celeste to tea in her cluttered study, surrounded by a lifetime of notebooks and manuscripts. "I've been writing for 70 years, Sophia said, her voice soft but clear. "And I'm only now beginning to understand what poetry really is. It's not about the words themselves, though we must honor and craft them carefully. It's about creating spaces between the words where truth can breathe. You understand this already. I can see it in your work, Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. They spent the afternoon together, not talking much, simply sitting in comfortable silence occasionally, broken by the sharing of a line or image. When Celeste left, Sophia pressed a small leather notebook into her hands. "This was my first," she said. "Started when I was just about your age. Perhaps it will remind you that the journey is long, and that's a blessing, not a burden." The return journey to the village felt like emerging from a dream, or perhaps entering one. The familiar landscapes appeared somehow different, enriched by the experience of having left and returned. Celeste understood now what mystics meant by the journey changing the traveler. She was the same person but also transformed, carrying within her all the voices she had encountered, all the words she had read, yet still essentially herself. Her mother was waiting in the garden when the carriage arrived, the evening light golden on her face. The embrace they shared was wordless but full of meaning. Her mother had been holding the space of home, keeping it ready for her daughter's return, understanding that some birds must fly far before they know where their true nest is. That night, alone in her room with the moon streaming through the familiar window, Celeste opened the notebook Sophia had given her. The first page contained a poem in young handwriting, uncertain but sincere, about watching rain on window panes. It could have been written by Celeste herself. This recognition that all poets across all time shared something fundamental filled her with both humility and courage. She began to write, not moon poems this time, but what she would call her return verses, pieces about the circular nature of journeys, about how leaving and returning were both necessary movements in the dance of becoming. The words flowed with a new authority, informed by her experiences but not enslaved by them. She was still the girl who talked to the moon, but now she knew she was part of a vast constellation of souls who had done the same throughout history. The summer progressed in its familiar rhythm, but Celeste's work took on new dimensions. She began experimenting with longer forms, sequences that built meaning through accumulation rather than compression. Professor Gray, on his next visit, was astounded by the development. "It's as if you've aged years and months," he said. Though what he really meant was that her gift had found new rooms within itself, new spaces to explore. The village noticed changes too, subtle but unmistakable. Celeste moved with more confidence, her shyness replaced by a quiet self-assurance. She began teaching some of the village children to write simple poems, helping them see the magic in everyday observations. The baker's daughter discovered she could capture the smell of bread in words. The blacksmith's son found poetry in the rhythm of hammer on anvil. As autumn approached with its familiar signs, leaves beginning their slow transformation, morning mist lingering longer in the valleys, Celeste sensed she was approaching some kind of threshold. The poems were coming differently now, not struggled for or even searched for, but arriving fully formed, as if they had always existed and were simply waiting for her to be ready to receive them. One night, when the moon was dark and only starlight illuminated her pages, she wrote what many would later consider her masterpiece, though she was still just 11 years old. The poem was about presence and absence, about how the moon was always there even when invisible. How silence was not the absence of sound, but its own form of communication. How darkness was not the opposite of light, but its necessary companion. The language was simple, almost bare, yet each word carried enormous weight, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that expanded endlessly outward. She knew, even as she wrote it, that this poem was different. It seemed to come from a place deeper than her individual consciousness, deeper even than the collective unconscious that Jung would describe decades later. It came from the source itself, the place where all creativity originates. She was merely the vessel, the particular configuration of consciousness through which these words chose to enter the world. When she showed it to Master Hartwell, the old teacher read it once, then again, then set it down and looked at her for a long moment. "My dear child," he said finally, "you have graduated far beyond anything I can teach you. This is the kind of work that will be read as long as humans seek meaning through language." But Celeste felt no pride, only a kind of grateful exhaustion, as if she had climbed a great mountain and could now see the endless range of peaks stretching beyond. Each poem was both a completion and a beginning, each silence between poems as important as the words themselves. She was learning to live in the space between inspiration and expression, the place where true poetry is born. The winter of her 12th year brought deep snow that transformed the village into a world of pristine white silence. Celeste spent long hours at her window, watching how snow fell, each flake following its own path yet contributing to the same inevitable accumulation. She saw in this a metaphor for her own work. Each poem distinct, yet part of a larger pattern she couldn't quite perceive. Her health, always delicate though she rarely complained, began to show signs of strain. Not illness exactly, but a kind of ethereal quality, as if she were slowly becoming more spirit than flesh. Her parents worried, but the village doctor could find nothing wrong. "She's just made of different stuff than most," he said, not unkindly. "Like those alpine flowers that bloom above the tree line. Surviving on less, but producing something more beautiful because of it. The spring of that year arrived so gently. It was as if nature itself had chosen to move more quietly around the young poetess, matching her increasingly contemplative rhythm. Celeste had begun to write less frequently, but each poem that emerged carried the weight of concentrated starlight, compressed into words that seemed to glow softly on the page. Her handwriting had evolved too, becoming more flowing, like water finding its way across paper, leaving traces that were both fleeting and eternal. She spent longer periods in silence now. Sometimes entire days would pass without her speaking. Though her parents noticed, she was always listening, always observing with those grey eyes that had taken on an almost translucent quality, as if she could see through the veils between worlds. Margaret worried at first, but came to understand that Celeste was entering deeper chambers of creativity, places where words were born before they became words. The moon poems had transformed into something beyond poetry. They had become meditations, prayers, conversations with the infinite. She no longer wrote them down immediately, instead carrying them within her for days, weeks, allowing them to ripen like fruit on invisible trees. When she finally committed them to paper, they emerged complete, perfect, requiring no revision, as if they had been revised in some other realm before entering this one. Summer drifted in on waves of honeysuckle scent and the drowsy hum of afternoon bees. Celeste would sit for hours in the garden, so still that butterflies would land on her shoulders, mistaking her for part of the landscape. She had begun to speak of the poems as if they were living things, with their own desires and destinies. "This one wants to sleep for 100 years, she would say, tucking a verse into a special box. "It's not ready for the world yet, but someday someone will need exactly these words." Her 13th birthday passed almost unnoticed, marked only by a special dinner her mother prepared and a new notebook from her father, bound in midnight blue leather that felt soft as whispers beneath her fingertips. Professor Gray visited less frequently now, understanding that Celeste had moved beyond the need for external validation or guidance. She had become her own teacher, learning from sources that couldn't be found in any library. That autumn brought unusual mists that would roll through the village at twilight, transforming familiar places into dreamscapes. Celeste would walk through these mists, disappearing and reappearing like a figure from ancient mythology. Several villagers later reported seeing her during these walks. But when they looked again, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender and the feeling that they had glimpsed something not quite of this world. The poems from this period were discovered much later, hidden in various places throughout the cottage, tucked behind loose stones in the garden wall, folded into the pages of her father's books, sewn into the hems of old dresses, each one a gift for future finders. As if she knew that her words would need to travel through time in secret ways, emerging when they were most needed. Winter descended like a soft blanket, muffling sounds and slowing time to a gentle crawl. Celeste spent most of her time by the window now, writing when the moon called to her, resting when it didn't. Her parents had moved her bed closer to the window so she could see the sky without rising. Understanding that the connection between their daughter and the celestial sphere was not metaphorical, but essential, necessary for her continued existence. On particularly clear nights, when the stars seemed to pulse with ancient rhythm, she would write what she called her star verses, poems that attempted to capture the music of the spheres, the harmonies that held the universe together. These were her most abstract works, barely poems at all, more like mathematical equations written in metaphor, patterns that revealed themselves only to those who read with their hearts rather than their minds. Master Hartwell, now very elderly himself, would still visit occasionally, sitting quietly while Celeste wrote. Their conversations had evolved beyond words, communicating in glances and gentle nods, in the shared understanding that comes from long companionship. He had begun collecting all her work, creating a careful archive, sensing that preservation was now his primary purpose. One evening in late February, as plum blossoms began to appear despite the lingering cold, Celeste announced quietly that she had written her last moon poem. Her parents, startled, asked what she meant. She smiled, that ethereal smile that had become her primary expression, and explained that the moon had taught her everything it could, that their conversation was complete, though their friendship would endure beyond words. She was 14 now, though she seemed both older and younger simultaneously, as if age had become irrelevant to her existence. She moved through the cottage like a gentle ghost, leaving traces of poetry everywhere. Words written in steam on windows, verses traced in spilled flour on the kitchen table, poems planted like seeds that would bloom in unexpected moments when someone noticed them. The village had begun to regard her as something between a saint and a spirit, a being who belonged to them but also to something larger. Children would leave flowers on her doorstep, not knowing why, just feeling it was right. Adults would find themselves pausing in their work when they saw her pass, experiencing a momentary peace that lingered long after she had gone. Spring returned, bringing with it a proliferation of wildflowers that seemed especially abundant that year, as if nature itself was celebrating something. Celeste spent entire days in the meadow, lying among the flowers, becoming part of the landscape. Her notebooks from this time contain more drawings than words, sketches of cloud formations, patterns of grass, the architecture of spider webs, as if she was even discovering languages beyond human speech. She had begun giving her notebooks away, pressing them into the hands of surprised villagers with simple instructions. Keep this safe. Someday someone will need it. The baker's wife received a volume of poems about bread and transformation. The blacksmith was given verses about fire and making. The young mother with the new baby found a notebook of lullabies on her doorstep, each gift perfectly chosen, as if Celeste could see into the future needs of every soul. Margaret had started documenting everything, sensing that time was becoming precious. She would sit quietly in the corner while Celeste worked, noting the way she held her pen, the particular angle of her head when listening to inner voices, the quality of light she preferred. These observations would later become invaluable to scholars trying to understand the mystery of her creative process. Summer arrived with unusual gentleness, days flowing into one another like honey poured from a great height, slow and golden and sweet. Celeste had begun speaking of seeing threads, golden threads that connected all living things, creating patterns of such beauty that she would weep at the sight. She tried to capture these visions in words, but increasingly found language inadequate, turning instead to silence, to gesture, to the simple presence that communicated more than any poem could. Her final public appearance was at the village's midsummer celebration. She arrived as the sun was setting, wearing a simple white dress that seemed to capture and reflect the dying light. She didn't speak, just stood at the edge of the gathering, smiling that transcendent smile. Everyone who was there later reported feeling blessed, though they couldn't say exactly why, as if her presence alone was a kind of benediction. After that night, she rarely left her room, though she could be seen at her window, especially during the full moon, writing or simply gazing upward with an expression of such profound peace that those who glimpsed her felt their own troubles dissolve. Her parents took turns sitting with her, reading aloud from her favorite books or simply maintaining quiet companionship. The poems from these final months were her most luminous, though only fragments survived, written on scraps of paper, on leaves, once on a piece of bark using charcoal from the fire. They spoke of completion and continuity, of endings that were really beginnings, of the way consciousness persists even as forms dissolve. Each word seemed to carry multiple meanings, rippling outward like stones dropped in still water. Autumn came softly, painting the world in muted golds and browns. Celeste had stopped eating solid food, sustaining herself on honey water and the occasional sip of herb tea. She seemed to be transforming into something else, something made more of light than matter. Her parents understood, with the deep intuition of love, that their daughter was preparing for a journey they couldn't follow. She gave her final poetry reading on an October evening when the moon was new, invisible but powerfully present. She gathered her family, Margaret, Master Hartwell, and spoke her last complete poem from memory. It was about gratitude, about the privilege of having been a vessel for words, about how every poem was both a greeting and a farewell. Those who heard it said later that the words seemed to hang in the air, visible almost, before slowly dissolving like morning mist. The next morning, she handed her father a sealed envelope. For later, she said simply, "Much later." Inside, though he wouldn't open it for years, was a poem about grief and joy, about how loss and love were simply different faces of the same eternal truth. It would become one of the most copied poems in history, offering comfort to countless mourners, though its origins remained mysterious for centuries. Winter approached with unusual warmth that year, as if the seasons themselves were being gentle. Celeste spent her days in a state between sleeping and waking, dictating occasional fragments to whoever was present. These last utterances were collected carefully, though they seemed less like poems and more like messages from another realm, barely translated into human language. She spoke often of the moon during those final weeks, not with sadness, but with anticipation, as if preparing to visit a beloved friend after a long separation. "I'll become part of the light," she told her mother one evening. "Every time the moon shines, a little of me will be there, watching, blessing, remembering." Her last written words were found later, inscribed on her window with a finger dipped in water, already evaporating when discovered. "Thank you for the words," was all it said, though whether she was thanking the moon, the universe, or the words themselves, no one could say. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Celeste asked to be moved to the window one final time. The moon was full, casting silver light across fresh snow, creating a landscape of such ethereal beauty that it seemed like a doorway to another world. She smiled, that same transcendent smile she had worn since childhood, and closed her eyes. Some say she simply fell asleep. Others, that she dissolved into moonlight itself. Her parents found her the next morning, peaceful, gone, but somehow still present in a way they couldn't explain. The room smelled of lavender and held a quality of light that lingered for days, as if she had left something of herself behind. A blessing, a promise, a poem without words. The village mourned quietly, understanding that grief and gratitude were appropriate in equal measure. They had been privileged to witness something rare, a soul that had lived entirely as itself, translating the ineffable into language that could touch other souls across the distances of time and space. Her notebooks were gathered, hundreds of them, containing thousands of poems, fragments, observations, drawings. Most would be lost over the years, destroyed by fire, flood, the casual carelessness of those who didn't understand their value. But enough survived, hidden in attics, preserved in private collections, copied by hand and passed secretly between those who recognized their worth. Centuries would pass. The village would grow into a town, then shrink again. The cottage where she lived would crumble, be rebuilt, crumble again. But on certain nights, especially when the moon is full, visitors to that place report a strange phenomenon. They hear whispers, not quite words, more like the memory of words, as if the very air remembers the poems that were written there. Scholars would debate her legacy, some claiming she never existed at all, that the poems attributed to her were actually written by multiple authors over many years. Others insisting that the consistency of voice, the unique perspective, could only come from a single consciousness. The arguments would continue for generations and overs, but for those who truly read her work, who allowed it to enter their hearts, such debates were irrelevant. What mattered were the poems themselves, still doing their quiet work, still offering comfort to insomniacs staring at the moon, still providing words for feelings that had no other expression, still connecting souls across the vast loneliness of human existence, reminding us that someone else has felt this too, has stood at this window, has watched this light. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of the Moonlight Poetess. Not the scholarly editions of her work, not the critical analyses, not even the biographies that try to capture who she was, but the simple fact that somewhere, right now, someone is reading her words and feeling less alone. Someone is finding in her verses the exact medicine their soul needs. Someone is discovering that poetry can be a bridge between the temporal and eternal. The fragments of her work that survive are like stars, distant but still shining, still capable of navigation, still beautiful enough to make us pause in our hurried lives and remember that there is magic in the world, that words can carry consciousness across centuries, that the moon has always and will always inspire certain souls to reach beyond themselves. In the great library of the capital, there is a room dedicated to her work, climate-controlled, carefully preserved. Scholars must wear white gloves to handle the original manuscripts. But the poems themselves resist such careful containment. They want to be free, to travel on the wind, to be whispered in the dark, to dissolve into consciousness like sugar into warm milk. And so they escape, copied in secret, shared between lovers, tucked into letters, left on pillows, painted on walls, tattooed on skin. They become part of the living stream of human expression, no longer belonging to any one person or time, but to everyone who has ever looked at the moon and felt that mixture of longing and belonging that defines our deepest humanity. Some say, if you know where to look, if you visit the ruins of her village on exactly the right night, when the moon is at exactly the right phase, you can still find new poems, written in dew on spiderwebs, traced in frost on windows, spelled out in the arrangement of fallen leaves, as if She never really left, just changed form, became part of the eternal conversation between earth and sky, between silence and song, between the human heart and the infinite mystery it yearns toward. And now, as this story settles into silence, as these words fade into the space between sleeping and waking, perhaps you too can feel it, that gentle presence, that blessing that comes from knowing we are all connected, all part of the same vast poem being written across time. Each of us a word, a line, a verse in something beautiful beyond our individual comprehension. The moon continues its eternal journey, carrying her light and ours, weaving all our stories together. And somewhere, in some cottage, in some village, another child is looking up at that same moon, feeling the first stirrings of poetry, preparing to add their voice to the endless song. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits, or perhaps just peaceful sleep.